hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperative. The distinction between duty and inclination required by Kant's concept of morality is further exemplified by the difference between hypothetical imperatives in the plural and categorical imperative in the singular. An imperative is a command, a duty of precisely the sort Kant says is inextricably linked to genuine moral motives for action. Kant's concept of the categorical imperative is one of the most important and controversial contributions ever to have been made in the history of ethics. The categorical imperative lays rationalist foundations for a metaphysics of deontological moral philosophy unconditioned by empirical contingencies of interest or circumstance. It crystallizes a single rule of ethical conduct presented in relation to the will as practical reason dictating the law of reason to itself, which Kant interprets as the transcendental ground of free, morally responsible action. The categorical imperative is expressed by Kant in no less than three distinct forms, which he regards as different, compatible formulations of an identical underlying principle. It is crucial, first of all, to understand Kant's distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives, both of which make different types of command governing moral decision-making. Kant characterizes the general theory of imperatives in this way, and it is in yellow in front of you. The representation of an objective principle insofar as it is necessitating for a will, is called a command of reason, and the formula of the command is called an imperative. The general idea of an imperative is a principle that commands action. It requires those subject to its principles to do something and hence provides the occasion and justification for the action that is commanded. We read continuously on the blue font, blue color na highlight now. All imperatives are expressed by an ought and indicate by these the relation of an objective law of reason to a will that by its subjective constitution is not necessarily determined by it. They say that to do or to omit something would be good, but they say it to a will that does not always do something just because it is represented to it that it would be good to do. Practical good, however, is that which determines the will by means of representations of reason, hence not by subjective causes, but objectively, that is from grounds that are valid for every rational being as such. It is distinguished from the agreeable as that which influences the will only by means of feeling, from merely subjective causes which hold only for the senses of these or that one, and not as a principle of reason which holds for everyone. The relevance of imperatives to ethics, according to Kant, is that they command the will for the sake of the good. An imperative is in the ordinary grammatical sense, is merely an order to do something. We are familiar with the concept from such contexts as the claim that it is imperative to wear your seatbelt, to practice gun safety, or to reconfirm your flight departure time. The word imperative in all of these cases means something that is vitally important to do. Its urgency seems understated by Kant's formulation that an imperative is something it is simply good to do. Although this is obviously also true, Kant explains that there are two fundamentally different types of imperatives, and it's now in color green in front of you. Now, all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. The former represents the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else that one wills. The categorical imperative would be that which represented an action as objectively necessary of itself without any reference to another end. The distinction between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperative parallels Kant's division between empirical and rational elements of ethics and between psychological inclination and moral duty. The difference is that a hypothetical imperative is conditional. It tells what we ought to do or commands a specific action if or in case we want to achieve some other end. What makes an imperative hypothetical is that it requires that a certain action be informed on the hypothesis that we want to attain another definite end. If you want to avoid automobile injury, then it is imperative that you buckle your seatbelt. If you want to hunt or target shoot without causing injury, then it is imperative that you practice gun safety. If you want to be assured that your airplane will depart as scheduled, then it is imperative that you reconfirm your flight, and so on. And I stay very close to the airport. That's why you can hear the planes flying. Significantly, hypothetical imperatives are conditional on desires or inclinations. If a certain end is desired, such as avoiding injury, then a certain means to that end is imperatively prescribed by a hypothetical imperative. More generally of interest for Kant is the application of hypothetical imperatives combined with conditional motivations of inclination as they figure in the empirically tainted, impure moral systems that his unconditional moral deontology opposes. A moral consequentialist says, conditionally in effect, that if we want to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number, then it is imperative that we strive through our actions, moral conduct, and legislation, and the like, to maximize pleasure and minimize pain and displeasure. It is also significant that Kant, from the outset, in introducing the distinction between the two types of imperatives, speaks of hypothetical imperatives in the plural and of the categorical imperative uniquely in the singular. The reason for this is clear if we consider the fact that there are many different desires and many different ends and inclinations, each of which can conceivably require multiple hypothetical imperatives as means to an end. The categorical imperative, by contrast, commands unconditionally. It is not something we must do if we want to achieve some other end, but something we are required to do no matter what other purposes we may have, as the end in itself of an unqualifiedly good will. The categorical imperative as such is not determined by the many different alternative purposes or ends towards which our actions are sometimes directed. Although the categorical imperative can be variously formulated, as Kant eventually does, and although the categorical imperative can have unlimitedly many applications, alternative expressions of the principle must all finally come to the same thing. The categorical imperative, as Kant implies, is therefore necessarily unitary, individual, and unique. Kant has yet to explain what the categorical imperative is or how it is understood. He has provided a strong hint in his statement concerning the universalizability of maxims in the case of moral principles that are represented by the will, in the case of actions directed by duty rather than inclination. It is evident from what we have already seen Kant saying that the categorical imperative is a moral command of duty that does not depend conditionally on the desire or inclination of any particular moral agents to attain any and other end or on any particular circumstances that happen to prevail, such as the existence of automobiles, firearms, or airplanes, among others, and hence is not subject to the empirical factors that Kant argues must be purged from the metaphysics of morals. The categorical imperative commands us unconditionally to act in a certain way. In Kant's ethical theory, empirical considerations of inclination and desire are associated with hypothetical imperatives, whereas moral duty and the requirements of pure reason in moral judgment are expressed by categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is the universal moral law that Kant maintains is represented by the will in the case of actions motivated by moral duty. Kant underscores the necessity of the categorical imperative by referring to it as apodeictic. By these, he means a principle of practical moral reasoning that is justified by pure reason, independently of experience, and in fact, as synthetic a priori. It is just the sort of principle Kant requires of metaphysics generally. Kant gives this characterization between hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperative in this way. He says, now, and it's now in color pink in front of you. Now, if the action would be good merely as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as in itself good, hence as necessary, in a will in itself conforming to reason as its principle, then it is categorical. Further, we can read, Hence, the hypothetical imperative says that only the action is good for some possible or actual purpose. In the first case, it is problematically practical principle. In the second, an assertorically practical principle. The categorical imperative, which declares the action to be of itself objectively necessary without reference to some purpose, that is, even apart from any other end, holds as an apodictically practical principle. The multiplicity of hypothetical imperatives is defended by Kant here on the grounds that although there are many different ends that rational agents may choose or otherwise be conditionally directed to attain, there is only one end or purpose shared by in common by all rational agents. Kant identifies the end or purpose of all rational agents as happiness. He argues that taking happiness as an end of all rational agents makes any imperative commanding the will towards this or that good, uh, is still at best a means to the universal psychological end of achieving happiness, and hence remains formally distinct from the categorical imperative. It is worthwhile to clarify what Kant means by hypothetical imperatives in order to better understand the categorical imperative. To the extent that Kant acknowledges a shared, even universal, and at least of all human rational agents with a happiness-oriented psychology that seems to typify our species, imperatives for action that are directed towards the attainment of happiness remains always a merely means to an end. No matter how common an end, and as such are hypothetical are rather than categorical. Let's read this one in color blue in front of you. There is, however, one end that can be presupposed as actual in the case of all rational beings, and therefore one purpose that they not merely could have, but that we can safely presuppose they all actually do have by a natural necessity, and that purpose is happiness. The hypothetical imperative that represents the practical necessity of an action as a means to the promotion of happiness is assertory. It may be set forth not merely as a necessary to some uncertain, merely possible purpose, but to a purpose that can be presupposed surely and a priori in the case of every human being because it belongs to his essence. Now, skill is the choice of means to one's own greatest well-being can be called prudence. In the narrowest sense, hence the imperative that refers to the choice of means to one's own happiness, the precept of prudence is still always hypothetical. The action is not commanded absolutely, but only as a means to another purpose. After elaborating on the means to end nature of hypothetical imperatives, Kant turns his attention to the categorical imperative. He begins by maintaining that there is only one such imperative because there's only one unconditional purpose of moral action. Kant describes the categorical imperative as concerned exclusively with the form of moral judgment and moral conduct as opposed to its matter or content. For this reason, Kant's pure moral philosophy and metaphysics is often said to be a formal moral theory. Kant draws a sharp distinction between the empirical or psychological content orientation of hypothetical imperatives and the purely formal character of the one and only categorical imperative. Let's read this one in color green in front of you. Finally, there is one imperative that, without being based upon and having as its condition any other purpose to be attained by certain conduct, commands this conduct immediately. This imperative is categorical. It has to do not with the matter of the action and what is the result from it, but with the form and the principle from which the action itself follows. And the essentially good in the action consists in the disposition, let the result be what it may. This imperative may be called the imperative of morality. Kant's moral formalism and the ontology go hand in hand. The formal nature of the categorical imperative and its exclusion of the means and contents or matter of all hypothetical imperatives is inimical to consequentialist concerns about the results or outcomes of actions as a measure of their morality. If a formalist ethical theory is incompatible with the effects or consequences of conduct in asserting moral value, then the ontology as an anti-consequentialist moral philosophy remains to be formalist. We have yet to discover everything that is implied by the Kantian deontological moral philosophy, but it is important to appreciate the extent to which Kant's formalist morality is consistently throughout a rejection of empirical elements in moral reasoning, not only in a subject's will and intent, but also in every aspect of the actions undertaken by the moral agent. If you like, this is number 7 of the lecture on Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. We're still using the Cambridge University Press edition. And if you haven't shared, subscribed, or liked this post, please do so and do subscribe to this channel, as we've said. This is, again, Samo't sa simula. Thank you very much for your support.